In this video, we will learn how to create reusable components in React. So what are reusable components? Reusable components are React components that can be used multiple times in the application. And as they have to be used multiple times in the application, they need to be generic enough and typically free from complex business logic. Why do we use reusable components? To ensure less code is written. If we can reuse code, obviously less code is written, development is faster, the code base is simpler and easier to maintain. So once you start writing large applications, reusable components becomes a very important part of the whole plan. For a component to be reusable, typically it takes in data or data sets via props. And if it has to return an output or anything, it would return it usually through a function that has been passed via props. It is recommended that mutable state should be kept in the state property of the component to ensure they work correctly. So anything internal to that component which is changing as a state, we keep it inside that component. And whatever input we want to get, we get it through props. Whatever output we want to send out, we send it through props. So let us look at a couple of examples, and as we start doing that, these aspects will become clearer. So define a component my button, and then what do we want to do? We want to make the my button reusable by providing the button text and the on-click handler as props. So here we have our my button. So let's just return a button which is getting rendered, and let's say put the text, say my button. Let's also define an on-click, say handle click. And what would be handle click here? Let's define the function handle click. Let's say we just do a console.log handle click in, say, my button. So this is our simple button. Next, let's go to our main component and use it. So we have imported it, and let's just maybe create two buttons here. Let's go ahead and run this code, and we can see we have these two buttons, and when we click on it, we get that. Now what was our second part of it? Make the my button reusable by providing the button text and on-click handler as props. So here in my button, we get in props. And what are the props we want to give? If we check here, we want to give, say, label is equal to, let's say in the first case, it is button 1. And in the second case, label is equal to, say, button 2. So the first change we do is we display, instead of my button, let's just display props.label. So let's test it. Now we get button 1, button 2. It works exactly the same way, but now these buttons can be configured from there. Next, what can we do here? We want these handlers to also come from the main component. So let's define function handle button 1 click as, what does it do? Console.log, let's call it button 1 click. Similarly, let's define another function so that we can distinguish between them. Button 2 click is button 2 click. And let's pass this function. So let's say handle click is equal to, and what is it? handle button, one click in the first case, and in the second button it is handle button 2 click. So we have now specified these. Now in my button, let's go ahead and say this would again be now props dot handle click. That's the function we have passed. So this should do it. Now let's test it. So now if I click on button 1, we get button 1 clicked. So here what we created was a simple component which we are now able to configure, control, manage from our main component. So this is the concept of a reusable component, and as we do some more deeper exercises, this will become clearer. Define a reusable component myTable to display a table. It takes the details of the header and data to be displayed as props. So typically we have a lot of use cases where we want to display a table. So let's create a reusable component for myTable, and it takes the header and the data as props. So what we have defined here is some table data. It has headers. The headers will tell us the name of the header, the field name, and the number of columns to show for that header. What will be the field name? So for the data, which field name does it map to? So the three fields are name, age, and company. And then we have the data with name, age, and company specified for all of them. So this is the kind of table we want to display. Now let's go to my table and see how do we build a reusable component here. So let's import React from React. Next function, my table. It takes props. And then what do we do here? What are we getting as? We would be getting headers and data from the props. So these are the two things we have gotten. Now we need to display it. So let's say return div. So now what do we need to do? The first row will be the headers. So let's just create a row and let's give it some style which we will keep specific to this. So text white. And within this we can display our headers. So we can just say headers dot map. And the index goes to. So within that we will just show a cell, a column. So div class name is equal to, and we need to show the column with the number of columns have been given in the h1 dot columns. So this will be the text displayed for the header, and these would be the number of columns. So how should we do that? Columns and h1 dot columns. So that would give us the number of columns, and we also want to say specify our key is equal to say index. Now what is the text we want to show here? h1 dot header. So we have now displayed the headers. Next, what do we need to show? We will need to show the data. So let's create our map for data. So data dot map. Now what does this map? So each row, let's call it row, each piece in the each JSON that we have. So if you look at the data, we have JSON. So let's call each JSON a row, and let's take its index. And what does it return? Let's say it returns us. We will need to create a row We will show a row for each JSON here, and let's put the key is equal to index. Now, how do we show it? We will need to map it to the same order of the names that we got in the headers. So let's do a headers dot map, say h1 comma index 2, let's call it here. And what does this go to? Now what do we show here for each value? We will show a column. So div class name is equal to, we will need to show the column. So what will be the width of a column? Calls, again h1 dot calls that we used, so we get that from here. We get those calls here. We can put the key is equal to, say, index 2, and within that we will need to show that text also. So what is the text that we show here? So the text will be t row, and which field do we want to show? h1 dot name. So this is what we want to show. So if we go back to our h data, so name, that field we will pick up and show it. So first we will show name, then we will show age, and then we will show company. And how do we get that order? The order in the headers. So we are using the same order of the headers. So we have now displayed that, and this table should now be fine. Let's export. So once we have exported it, let's try and use it in our main component. So to use it, we would also need to use data from here. Let's use that data. What do we need? We need table data. So let table data equal to require data1.js. Now here we can construct a component my table, and what do we pass as? So what would be the props here? So we can also deconstruct the table one. It has headers and data. So headers equal to headers, data equal to data. So we have passed a table. So we should now be able to see the table. Let's test it, and let's maybe put a text before it, displaying details, let's call it, and put, say, a let's test it now. So we are getting some form of issue here. Let's figure that out. How do we figure that out? One way is to look at the elements. Let's inspect them. So in the body, so this is the headers we formed, row. So this should have been calls 3. So one error we have done is, instead of calls, it should have been call. So this is one error. Let's fix it. So this much has improved. Now if we look at our data, what do we get here? And we are not getting any text here. So that seems to be the problem. Why are we not getting the text? T row h1 dot name. So there seems to be some issue here. Why are we not getting this data? So the error here is the name of the field is field. We probably misjudged it. So it should have been h1 dot field. That is the name of this field. If we go back, we made that mistake. Let's test it now. So now we can see we are starting to get that data. Let's put in some borders here so that it styles better. Let's test it. So we are now getting that table. So this is the table we have gotten. So this is starting to look much better. Let's to test it. Let's say we have another data set which is structured very similarly, but this has 4 columns: name, age, company, and city. And each data has this. So instead of using data 1, if we are now using data 2, so let me make that change here and call it, say, data 2. So data 2, as you can see, is very similar. The headers and the data are very similar, and we would share the data 1 and the data 2 in the description. So now the table should have changed, and you can see the table has completely changed. We have gotten the 4 fields, all the values are visible. So this is how we have constructed a reusable component. So this component, based on the values we have provided, is able to render it as we want it. Next, what do we want to do? Also add the functionality to delete a row from the table. So the table that we created with my table, we also now want to show a column in it with delete. And when we click on it, that row gets deleted from the table. So how should we do that? So here, when we are calling my table, let's say we also send it some delete options. Delete option is true. We want to show the delete option. It will be shown in 2 columns, and say on delete is equal to is handle delete. So we send it a function also, and here we send it delete options is equal to delete options. So we've sent this, and let's also construct this function here, function handle delete. It will take the index of the value it wants to delete, and what should it do? It should basically delete it from the data. So data dot splice index comma 1. So the data would get spliced, and it would be able to do that. Now once we have done that, let's go to my table and see what do we need to do. So let me just copy that structure. So this is what we are gonna get, and let's destructure it from props. Now what all do we want to show? In the header there will be no change, but while we are showing each row, we want to also show a delete button. So after we have shown all the data for that row, we will need to show another column, class name is equal to, what's the column? Number of columns is delete options dot calls border, and what do we show within it? We show a button is equal to btn, say btn warning, and delete. What should its on click be? This, or there will be no this here, so let's call it handle delete, and it will pass the index. Which index will it pass? It will pass this index. So now let's define this function handle delete. It takes an index as parameter, and what does it do? It will basically call the props dot on delete with the index. That is what it would do. So this should now add it. Let's go ahead and test it. So here we can see we are getting a delete button. If I click on delete here, we get an issue. Props dot on delete is not a function. Let's test it. So on delete we passed this handle delete was fine. Where did we get the error? So this is the error. So it should not be props dot on delete, it should be props dot, or it should have been delete options dot. This is the error we did because it's coming under the structure here. Let's test it again. So now if I click on delete, we don't get anything happening. Why is that so? Let's see if we are getting the call here. Console.log delete and index. So we are getting those deletes, but these deletes are not getting displayed. Now why is that the case? Why are these deletes not showing up or calling it? Because nothing in the state is changing for something to get rendered. So how should we handle that part of it here? So as we saw, the calls are happening, we are splicing it, but they are not getting displayed. Why is that? Because there was no change in the state, so it was not getting re-rendered. So how should we put it in the state? Let's use that. So let's use useState, and here let's say const table, let's call it table, and set table is equal to useState, and we initialize it with table data. Now once we have initialized it with table data, here instead of saying let headers comma data is equal to table data, we will now use the value from the state. So we will use table, and what will we do here? When we get here, we will need to splice that data, so and we will need it to set it back in the set table. So how will we do that? Let new data is equal to, let's make a copy of data, let's splice new data, and then we will use set table to update our state. And what should we set it to? We will spread our table, and then we will say data is new data. So this would spread all the other fields and just change the update the data. Once we have done that, we will always continue to get this. So let's test it now. So now when I click on delete, you can see I am able to delete all of them. So that's the change. So now if I click on delete, we get delete, and this is working. So remember this change, because we were not running it through the state, obviously no change would get reflected. Next, what do we want to do? Define a reusable component myForm to create a basic form. So far we have used tables, and we have seen the power of defining reusable tables with myTable, a component that we defined for our purpose. We want to now do a similar thing for a basic form and create a reusable component called myForm. So here in our data1.js, we also have these form fields. So these would give us information about creating the form. So what are the data here? It has a label, name. The name of the field is name. So label will be what is shown for that form element. Type is text and a placeholder. And we are assuming right now that all of these are text fields. So we have been given this structure. We want to construct that form, get its value, and push it into this table. So that is our objective. So here let's start creating a myForm. So let's start writing the code for myForm. Import React, use state from React function myForm, and it takes the props, And what do we do here? So we will need to first pass those fields. So let's do that part of it. So if we go to the main component, we got the data1.js from table data. So we should also get the form fields. Let's do that. Now what do we want to do? Let's import my form from and here let us just show a my form. What are the values we will need to give it? We will need to send it the form fields so that it knows which fields to display, and we will also need to send it a on submit, which is say a handle submit that we create here. Why would we need that? So when the form is submitted, we will use that to push data into the table. So let's do that. So let's define it now. Function handle submit. It will get the form data, and what should it do? We know that this is the data, this data has the data, so we need to push it there. So let new data equal to, we spread the data and we push the form data at the end of it. Once we have done that, like we did earlier, we will just use set table, spread our table, that's our field, and then make data as new data. So this will now push it into it, and this will also update the state. So now we need to construct this component my form. So let's start doing it. And for a minute, let's just copy one line of it and keep it there so that we can continuously reference it. So the purpose of it is that we can continuously reference those field names. So let's get the form fields is equal to props. Let's now construct our form. So now within the form, what do we not need to do? For each field in form fields, we will need to show a text field. So how should we do that? So we should do a form fields dot map, and let's say we call it field comma index. Now what does this go to? So for each we will now show a field. So we can now say div class name is equal to form group, and we can also add the key is equal to index. Now within that we will show our input. Now let's configure the fields. The name will be equal to field dot name, that is the name. Next, what do we want to configure? Type. Are we given data on the type? Yes. So let's configure it field dot type. Next, we can put the placeholder is equal to field dot placeholder. Now what all do we want to configure? We need value. Now value should be equal to something. So we will need some place to store the values, and we will need to define our on change. So these are our two requirements that are left here, and let's just define our class name is equal to say form control. So we need to store these values somewhere and also handle the on change. So how should we do these two things? So one way to handle it, typically when we use forms, we construct all the fields. We would need the values. We will need something to store it. We can create a JSON which has all these fields in it. So if we go back here, we will need a JSON which has 3 fields: name, age, company. If we create that, then we can easily handle it. Now, how do we create such a JSON? Let's use form fields. Form fields dot reduce accumulated comma current goes to, and for each field here that we get, each value that we get in form fields, we push that name into the JSON with an empty value. So what can we say? Accumulated, and for current dot name is an empty string. So this field has gotten added to the JSON, and we can just return accumulated, and we initialize this with an empty JSON. Let's say let initial form is equal to this. So we get an initial form. So once we have created our initial form, we will set it in the state so that all the changes can be done through the state. So let's say const fields comma set fields is equal to useState, and what is its initial value? Initial form. So once we have constructed it, we can now use the fields here. So what will value be? In the fields, which form do we want to choose? Field dot name. That is what we want. So in this fields, this field dot name would be the value. So that's our value. And let's also define now a on change. Let's say on change is equal to handle change. So let's define a function handle change. Function handle change takes an event, and what does it do? Now this event will work exactly similar to what we have been doing earlier. Let's do that. Const current target colon input is equal to E. Now what do we need to update? We need to update the fields. So let fields 1 is equal to, we spread the fields, fields 1 input dot name is equal to input dot value. We update the name and we set it to the state, which is set fields, and what should be the fields 1. So standard handle change we have been able to use. So now both these things are working. Now what is left after that? Now what do we need to do? We will need to create a submit button. So let's do that. And we should display submit. And what should its on click be? So on click we can just either call the, what did we get? Props dot on submit with the value fields, or we could have defined a separate function to do it. So this was the value we got on submit, so we have used that. So this should now show our form, and let's export default my form. Let's go ahead and try and test it. Let's put maybe a h2 new details. So we have displaying it earlier, and let's put in new details. Say Tim, age is 35, company is, let's say, Facebook. And now when I click submit, you can see we have gotten these details here. So these details are coming in here. What we should have also been able to do, that when we are submitting it, these details should also get nullified. So how can we do that? So to do that, let's create a handle submit where we will also set the fields. So handle submit, it's a function. And what do we do in it? We will just call our fields, and we can then set our set fields. So this should work, and here instead of this we will just call our handle submit. Let's test it. So let's enter the values. So once we have entered it, this form has become empty, and we can let's put in something else, Timothy, and so on. Let's test it for the other. So instead of data1.js, if I use data2.js, we should see a different form and a different table. That's the advantage of using these reusable components. So here let's make it data2.js. Data2.js has 4 fields now: name, age, company, and city. Let's test it. So now you can see we are getting that. We are getting those 4 fields here, and let's enter it. Say Tim 23, company was Facebook, city is in New York. And the same thing is working here. If you click on delete, the deletes are also working. So this is working fine.